We're finishing up in Luke chapter 15. And my title is A Man Who Had Two Sons. But before that, let me tell you about something. About a man who pulled up to Home Depot one day, and he took on 3 workers to help him to clear bamboo in his backyard. He told them that he would pay them $20 to do that work, that day's work. Well, around noon, he went back to Home Depot, and he picked up another 3 workers. And then at 3, he made another trip and picked up some more workers. Well, at the end of the day, he gave them their pay, and each and every one of them received $20. Well, guess what happened? The people who started working earliest in the morning started to complain. They said, hey, that's not fair. Why should they get the same thing we're getting? And the owner of the property said, well, you know what? What did we agree on? He says $20. Okay. So there's nothing unfair about it. And what's it to you if I'm being generous to these others who need the $20 to make it through the day? Well, that's a kind of a variation, a modern variation of a story that Jesus told in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. I don't know how you reacted when you heard the end of the story, but I still remember when I was in college when I came across this passage, and I thought, well, that's not fair. Those guys are right. That's not fair. And, at that point in my life, I had already been teaching Sunday school year after year for about 4 years on a weekly basis. By that time in my Christian life, I had already accumulated a pretty decent Christian library, spending all my money that I earned from my summer jobs on books. I had been already listening every night to the best of sermons on the Christian radio. And so I was not a new beginning Christian. But this story about grace, I really hadn't gotten. And it just shows how big of a change it is to move from an orientation of works and performance to an orientation of grace. In college, in a class called The History of Ideas, I read a book that talked about and originated the term paradigm shift. A shift in your whole model, your whole way of looking at things and understanding things. And I still remember his first example, that when the world went from thinking of Earth as a center of the universe and realizing that the sun was the center around which the earth revolved, it called for a radical reshifting of how people thought about the universe and their place in the universe. The shift from a works and performance orientation, I would say, to a shift in an orientation of grace is even greater and more difficult. And I find for me that I'm always backsliding, falling back into the works mentality. It's hard to consistently keep myself in the world of grace. Grace is wonderful, but applying grace is very difficult. The story of the prodigal son is about grace and about the two errors that betray grace. Grace that gives generously, that was provided at great cost when the father acquiesced to the request of the younger son and gave to both boys their inheritance early. And yet, for the younger son, he fell into the constant error of abusing grace. We talked about that last week. Oh, grace is great. Give me one more of it. If grace covers my sin, let me sin more so that I can receive more grace and God gets more glory. That's, I think, a tendency for young Christians who don't appreciate the costliness of grace. On the other hand, represented by the older son, the big brother, and very often a danger for people like me who have been longer and older as Christians, is the tendency to forget about grace and go into works. Because of all I'm doing, because of all I'm learning, because of my consistency and my effort to be a good Christian, I can start to become proud and think that all that stuff is what makes a difference between me and the other guy. And as we read in Ephesians 2, God doesn't operate that way. It's all by grace. And so today we come to the story of the long-forgotten brother. Growing up all those years, whenever we heard the story of the prodigal son, it's almost as if the other two people didn't fit into the story. Everything was about the younger son. Then we gradually heard more about the father. And then now we're rediscovering there was a third person in this story, the older brother. In fact, when Jesus started off this story, that's how he said it. There was a man who had two sons. And you know what? Here's the craziest thing. Who was this story for? Who was this parable for? It was for the Pharisees and the scribes. That when they murmured about how Jesus was eating with the publicans and sinners, he responded with this story. And so he was directing as his main audience, who? The scribes and the Pharisees. So now he finally gets to the point where he's directly addressing them. And yet all those years and all those sermons, this person was not even talked about. And Jesus has been working, flying like a stealth fighter, coming in to this point to catch the Pharisees, to finish the story before they even realize this is for them and about them. Now, lest we think that Jesus is going to hammer them, he doesn't. He's teaching them about grace, and he's going to do it gracefully. Okay? And so he's consistent. And he's coming to help them, to help the Pharisees to grasp something that would make their lives so much better, to make them so much happier in their relationship to God, to call them back to grace, to show how their lack of grace was hurting their community, and restore back the harmony that was needed in the family of God. And so this is where he's going. And I want you to keep that in mind as we read through this passage, if you can see this core. All right? That he's reaching out and he's calling the Pharisees to rediscover, or maybe discover for the very first time, this whole new way of operating grace, as opposed to works and performance. We're going to just read the final portion of Luke 15. We're starting at verse 25 to 32. All right? Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. All right? And then he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And the servant said to him, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound." But the older son, the older brother, he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." The Pharisees operated on a performance-based style, and Jesus is trying to point out this problem through the words that he puts into the mouth of the older brother, the older son. When the father comes out to try to get him to come in, he reveals this orientation by his response. He talks about how hard he has worked, namely that he has slaved for all these years. Notice it's all about his efforts. And then notice the other response of the father. He says to him, "Son, you are always with me." So on the one hand, this boy talks about efforts, slavery. The father talks about what? He doesn't talk about the efforts. He talks about the relationship. Okay? He talks about how he cherishes the fact and appreciates that the son had been with him all these years, and this is what really matters. A love relationship versus a works relationship. Effort without the right motivation turns the effort into drudgery, right? But if we do have the right motivation and it drives the effort, then the effort is a joy, it's a hobby, it's a pleasure. Remember that old story from the Old Testament about Jacob trying to earn his wife? How many years did that guy end up putting in before he got that wife? 14 years. That's a long wait. That's a lot of years. But verse 20 of Genesis 29 says this: "So Jacob served for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her." Just a few days, no slaving. You know, today when I see and hear about Christians who have come to feel so burdened, when they even express their minimal responsibilities toward God, I realize they're hurting. They've lost the sense of love. It is no longer the primary driving motivation. They have forgotten the immense bounty of grace that has been given to them. And it's getting really, really bad in these days. One example, God says, honor the Sabbath. One day out of 7. and not really even the whole day. Most Christians, they're willing, according to the surveys, to give church an hour and 15 minutes. All right? That's all. And they don't even come regularly. They make it when they can, when there isn't anything else distracting them. It's become burdensome. It's become very hard. And that's a sign that maybe the love has grown cold. I can go on with examples, but I want to just give you a real simple one. And so for me, understanding this as a pastor, I try really hard when I encourage people to grow, and I give suggestions for spiritual disciplines and exercises and practices that will help to transform believers, to develop God's kingdom as we're supposed to expand the reach of the gospel like we're supposed to. I do it with such care because I don't know if they're going to be doing it with the love that makes it a light and joyful work, or it becomes a drudgery and the whole thing becomes a slavery and the whole thing backfires on me. You see how difficult it can become once you lose that motivation. And yet, this is what we need to be doing. We've heard so much in the news about the obesity epidemic in America, even among the young. You know, since I was a kid, I was warned against spiritual obesity. You know, when you just come and receive and receive and receive, and you're not just putting in the same effort to channel what you've received into productivity and into the discovery of the giftedness that God has put into us. Well, the father closed their short but instructive dialogue in this way. And he reminds the older boy of the grace that's already been demonstrated. He says, all that is mine is yours. See, at the very beginning, when he sold his property, he gave all that he could. He held nothing back for himself. He did not do it with any strings attached. He just divided it up, and it was finished. It was completed. And that's why the younger son could take what he had, quickly liquidate, and take off. There was no possibility of revoking it. There were no conditions that could change it. He had given it to them from the beginning. And just as he let the younger son go, the same respect and freedom was given to the older son. And so we see how hyper-performance orientation of the Pharisees can get really out of whack with reality, because he puts these words into the mouth of the older boy. He says, and not only have I been a slave all these years, I have never disobeyed your command. To which we should say, hey, get real. Right? I mean, how many of us are that faultless? In fact, if Jesus wanted to be really a little bit harsh, he could have said, hey, what do you think you're doing right now? I've invited you into the house. I'm letting you dishonor and shame me in front of all my guests. I need you to come in. You should have come running as soon as you heard the music instead of pausing to check with a servant, because that's your responsibility as the eldest son, to be the co-host. You've never disobeyed me? No, Jesus didn't say that. But that's all in there. And it's unrealistic. But see, that's the problem with getting into a performance orientation. Because what happens is we figure and feel like we've got to impress. We got to hype up what we're doing. We got to make it sound so great, so good, so without blemish. Only people I know that does that is used car salesmen. So here we are, used car Christians. Okay? We're hyping up ourselves in order that our performance is the greatest. Grace, on the other hand, is about being set free from having to make up stories about how great we are. Grace is also about not being burdened by the performance and hyper-performance and feeling like we're slaves. Grace, instead, causes us to operate out of love so that we can serve God and feel like just a few days. It's so sweet. It's so enjoyable. Instead of sweat, it's sweet. That's the difference that it makes. And so Jesus wants to set the Pharisees free from the burden of feeling like they've become slaves to God's demands. It was their doing and not God's. He wanted them to also become people who feel blessed by grace. And to compound the tragedy, when we get into that performance mode, performance-based living, we not only are ourselves miserable, but the people around us are miserable. You ever been, as a child, when your mom was feeling unappreciated, and she makes the meal, and she's banging the pots and throwing the dishes on the table and telling you to hurry up and eat it, and how she slaved all day for it? Remember those? We knew what was going on. And that's what's going on here. And Jesus is trying to set them free, not only from burdening themselves, but burdening others. In Matthew 23, he talks about the Pharisees. And he says this about them: they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders. But they themselves are not willing to move with their finger. They won't lift the finger to help you out. Okay? Then a few verses further, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across the sea and land to make a single proselyte. And when he has become a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." Wow. The ability to make other people miserable. And so the older son is miserable, but he makes the father miserable, snubbing him and shaming him. He rejects his brother, making him feel bad in the middle of his party, referring to him not as my brother, but saying to the father, your son. Misery loves company, right? Why should I be the only one and feel bad? Dad, I want you to feel bad too. My younger brother should feel even worse. Misery. Much misery. The ESV translation is a little weak here. The literal for how he feels is not just anger, but it's fury. He is furious. The family has just become whole again. And he's going to come and he's going to smash that unity that is still so young and delicate and just forming. I have learned, after all these years of being a pastor and trying to grow as a human being, that when somebody expresses anger, all out of proportion to what's going on, I realize that it isn't about what's happening. It isn't just about me. There is a huge reservoir, a huge dam of pent-up resentment and anger from a lot of other things that's being broken now open and flooding to me. And so this is what the older brother is feeling. He's got all these years, all this work history where he has felt the resentment. And now we see that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more going on. You know, and it is something we run into in the churches. Every once in a while, recently in Christianity Today, read about a pastor who one day just lambasted his congregation. Can even happen to a pastor. He's angry over whatever from his years of working with the people. Maybe they're not responding. Maybe they're not growing. Maybe something bad has all happened and something he wanted to change in the church or move forward in the church, and he got refuted and turned away. Happens to moms. It happens to pastors. It happens to the nicest of people. It can happen to any one of us, is what I'm saying. And we need to be aware of it. We need to be watching out for it to find out. I've seen people angry in the church because they feel like God hasn't been fair to them. Okay? Why should these other guys who don't even go to church, who aren't even Christians, get all the breaks? And my business is such a struggle. I've heard that. This thing can get so out of hand. Not only do they take it out on others, but they'll take it out on their family, their workmates, other people in the church, and very often the pastor of the church. I've known people who have had such anger at God that they have moved from church to church, destroying church after church, causing splits, suing the leadership. You see, it's more common than you may know. And so Jesus comes to save the Pharisees, so to speak, and to move them from performance-based orientation to a grace-based. And out of that grace comes work and service and ministry that is propelled by love and generosity and goodness. The father in this story, in all 3 episodes, shows one of the key realities of grace in this story. And that is the simple fact that grace, when it matures, is a very consistent thing. It favors neither the younger brother nor the older brother. The grace that welcomes home the younger brother is the same grace that goes out and finds the older brother who, in his heart, is just as lost as the younger brother. Lost, but at home, but lost nevertheless. Lost from the relationship and lost from the sense of grace. And so he goes and he speaks to him so gently, so tenderly, saying, we've always had one another. And that's what matters most. That is what counts. And this is the place the older son needed to get to become set free. Instead of touting his years of slavery and his impeccable record of obedience. We read earlier in Ephesians chapter 2, and I'll just quote portions of several verses, but God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love, by grace you have been saved. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. Just think of it. We never have to say, I've slaved for you all these years. Never once have I disobeyed. You're set free from having to do that. The essence of grace is that God's love is unconditional. And this love is being shown to us in a tangible way. The Father modeled so much of what is described in 1 Corinthians 13. To the older son, certain parts of 1 Corinthians 13. To the younger son, other parts of 1 Corinthians 13. See if you can see which one got which. Love is patient and kind. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. Love endures all things. Love never ends. Those are the positive statements of love. In this classic description of love, it's quite puzzling how many of these things are not positive statements, but negative statements. Sometimes our refraining is an expression of love. Let me read some of the others. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing. You think the older brother needed to learn some of this stuff? That son of yours, who squandered his money on loose living and prostitutes. Where did he get this from? Out of his own head. You see? He rejoices at his brother's possible wrongdoing. Sometimes it's what we do. Sometimes it's what we don't do. That is all about love. And that is all about grace. And in these negatives, it's so much like the Ten Commandments, right? You ever wonder about that? Why so many of them are negative? Because God wanted to keep it simple. He could give you so much to do. But he just said, hey, just avoid these things. You know, keep it simple. Let me share 3 practices to help us to keep from becoming like the older brother. Things that the father modeled, that the 2 sons show the extreme of what we can fall into. Like the younger son to become an abuser of grace. Like the older son to defect from grace. It takes a lifetime of correction, maturation, and growth and struggle to come to this kind of a balance. I find at my age in life, I feel like I'm in the junior high stage of learning about grace. Philip Yancey, one of my favorite writers, in his book, talks about his struggle in the journey of learning grace. In the book, What's So Amazing About Grace? This is what he writes. I attended a Bible college. Years later, when I was sitting next to the president of the school on an airplane, he asked me to assess my education. Quote, some good, some bad, I replied. Quote, I met many godly people there. In fact, I met God there. Who can place a value on that? And yet, I realized that in 4 years, I learned almost nothing about grace. Oh my goodness. It may be the most important word in the Bible, the heart of the gospel. How could I have missed it? He continues on. I related our conversation at a subsequent chapel address, and in doing so, offended the faculty. Continuing on. Some suggested I not be invited back to speak. Gracelessness, right? Continuing on. One gentle soul wrote to ask whether I should have phrased things differently. Shouldn't I have said that as a student I lacked the receptors to receive the grace that was all around me? That could be true. A lot of times people show me grace and it goes totally unnoticed by me. Quote, because I respect and love this person, this man, I thought long and hard about his question. Ultimately, however, I concluded that I had experienced as much ungrace on the campus of a Bible college as I had anywhere else in life. You see, there was a lot of older brothers on that campus. There are a lot of older brothers in Christian institutions. And it's easy. It's easy when we're working so hard and trying to do our best to start becoming proud and start orienting ourselves away from grace and into performance. You know, you can brag about something when you have something to brag about, right? And so it's easy to just kind of slip off that middle ground. And as I say, Jesus is not condemning. He's hoping to enlighten so that people will be people of grace. So what are some things that we can do to keep in that middle ground and not be like the older brother? One, I'm going to give you 3. Stop picking on people. Okay? Sometimes we come close to emotional and spiritual abuse by how we criticize and correct others. You read in Paul's letters to the churches, guess those people, who were they always criticizing? They were criticizing the apostle. You see how easy it is to fall into that syndrome. In the Galatian church especially, where this performance-based religion was starting to snuff out the grace that had been first the blessing there, where they started getting into negativity, browbeating, criticizing, comparing, and backsliding, Paul warned them in chapter 5, verse 15. He says this, but if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. You see, very real problem. Secondly, and this is kind of closely related to the other one, another bad practice among Christians, the practice of judging. Standing in a superior position with the sense of a right to exercise our expectations over others. Writing to the believers in Rome, he says this in chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on one another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. Chapter 14, he says it again. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another, namely God? It is before his own master that he stands or fall, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. God is working his plan, his schedule, and his wisdom in that person's life, and you can't possibly know it. So back off. Take it light. Stop being other people's masters, because only Jesus can be. Third, here's the flip side, what we should do to become stronger in grace. And it is this. Those of you who have been reading in Our Daily Bread, keeping up with our good spiritual habits, you ran across this passage. Before I give it, the other one we've been working on is getting here at what time for worship? Okay, keep up with that too. Here is the passage, Romans 13:8. owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, this one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Verse 10, love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is fulfilling the law. Love is not something we feel alone. Love is not when we feel like it and then we do it. Christian love, grace, is not a feeling but an obligation. It is an act of will. When we do these things, then it becomes a living sacrifice, far more, in my opinion, than any composition Bach ever composed. Sometimes it shows up in the form of seriously listening to someone. Sometimes it shows up in a few extra moments of patience. Sometimes we suck up an offense that we have just received from someone else and understand that some of this, maybe a lot of it, maybe all of it, comes out of some inner pain in that person. Somebody reached out to me this weekend for help. Somebody who's not a Christian, but is related to some Christians. And so I've been trying to understand what he needed, and we've been corresponding. And after I wrote one letter, he wrote back something that was kind of negative, kind of putting me down, kind of, hey, don't do this. Did I give you permission? And I read it and I says, wow, he's hurting over what he's going through. And I realized it wasn't about me, because later on, as I continued to correspond, he softened. He realized that it wasn't about me. It was about him and what he was going through. To all, the depth of love is the best kind of indebtedness. It is the kind of indebtedness that we should hope to pay off forever and ever. Grace is the lesson of a lifetime. Like I said, even now, I feel like I'm in junior high, maybe the 9th grade, still slipping back and forth, trying to stay more and more in the middle. This is a journey that we all share. Maybe I'm overestimating my progress, but I'll keep working on it. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your graciousness, shown without favoritism to anyone, consistent, equal, patient. Help us, therefore, to be gracious even to ourselves, so that when we err in one direction or the other, we can learn the graciousness of the Father, and we can go out to ourselves and call ourselves back into that community of grace that is shared in the Godhead and you want to fill the church with. So, Lord, lead us in this journey. Open our eyes to see. Help us that when we receive grace, we will rejoice over it. We will not abuse it. And then, when the occasion arises, and help us to make as many occasions as possible, we would be those who are giving grace, grace abounding to sinners and everyone else. Thank you again. Teach us about grace. I'm going to give you a moment now to silently pray. Where do you tend to err? Are you a grace abuser? Or perhaps if you've grown up in a household or in a background where performance was the main concern, and it's hard for you to get out of it and become a grace giver, and to escape from being performance-based. Pray personally for God to lead you, to show you, to help you. So finally, God, as we said last week, in that final verse of 2 Peter, you have called us to grow in grace, in the knowledge of Jesus. Help us to do that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.